Every game to ever exist has its own pros and cons, and in today's video we're going over a game which is no different. We're looking at the Far Cry series and we're going to be highlighting the worst thing from each Far Cry. But before we do get into the video, if you're really looking for the best experience when playing games, then you must try Rogue Energy. Rogue Energy is a premium energy supplement designed to optimize your mental and physical performance. It promises to help boost your energy while still being delicious without all the unhealthy negatives of traditional energy drinks. You can buy these in tubs, packets, or even as cans, and you simply mix the flavor in with cold water or milk if you want to be real fancy. The cool thing with this is if you are unsure whether or not this would be something that you would like, you can actually try this entirely for free. Use the link in the description down below to claim your free Rogue Energy samples, and if you want to get more, make sure you use the code GTG to get 10% off every purchase. Getting back into the video, we're going through the worst things from every single Far Cry, and of course we're starting all the way back in 2004 where this series began with Far Cry. This in itself was a huge success. This is what kicked off the whole franchise. Without the first Far Cry, well, the franchise wouldn't exist. But a downside to it is that unfortunately it hasn't aged well. It was amazing for its time back in 2004 and certainly ahead of other types of games, but simply now there's no reason to go back. And because this is a franchise which Ubisoft have constantly pushed forward with new iterations of the game, with every single element which was good with Far Cry, there's now major improvements throughout other games within the series. And because of that, it hasn't really been worth Ubisoft going back to remake it, despite it being the starter of what is an amazing franchise. They did do a remake, which was under the Far Cry Wild Expedition, but that was years ago, and even then, that is still somewhat outdated. Far Cry 2. With this one, Ubisoft really wanted to take things to a whole new level. It took 4 years to release after the initial Far Cry. This one was released in 2008, and the big issue that many players found was the overall difficulty of the game. This was a true challenge, and not in just the traditional sense of you having to fight off waves of enemies from different locations across the world. The protagonist also had malaria, and this meant that you had to keep on completing side quests to gain medicine and actually keep your character alive. It was a constant fight for survival, which left the hardcore players actually enjoying this game, but for the rest of the fan base, they didn't. It was just way too much. Far Cry 3, the most popular title throughout the whole franchise, and I'm sure you're all wondering, it's probably the reason that you clicked on this video. How could you find something wrong with Far Cry 3? It is hands down amazing, and you're correct. But if I was really trying to push to find something bad about this, it would be the design of the story missions. Now, something important to note is that that doesn't mean that the story is bad. Far from it. The story is amazing and is an example of some of the best detailed characters from any game ever, not just from Ubisoft, but from a lot of open world games who have since taken inspiration from Far Cry 3. But with that said, because of how the story was with it being in this linear approach, it brought some limitations to the missions, such as you being locked in certain positions whilst others have pointless countdowns that don't really do anything significant. This is actually a problem that Ubisoft have, not just with Far Cry, but across other franchises that they own, including Assassin's Creed, where you'll have a story which could be amazing, but they end up repeating the exact same missions over and over again just to facilitate that story. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. Despite still having Far Cry 3 within the title, it is its own separate title. But due to its budget limitation, it had to take quite a lot of assets and gameplay features from Far Cry 3. And this is the worst thing about it. This is one of those things which is out of the developer's control, because if you were needing to push out a new title for a game, but you have a limited budget, of course you're going to pick the latest version that was just released successfully in order for you to reuse gameplay mechanics as well as assets. By itself, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon did extremely well, not just from a financial standpoint, but also from a player's standpoint, with it still being entertaining to play through. But it was just that constant feel, even though this is its own separate title, that when playing through, it ended up feeling more like a DLC of Far Cry 3 when that just wasn't the case. Far Cry 4. Far Cry 4 was released in 2014, which now means that this series was going on for a decade. And all in all, with every title that Ubisoft was pushing, it seemed to get better and better. But the downside to Far Cry 4 were the Shangri-La missions. Now, for a lot of the missions throughout the game, as well as some of the new gameplay mechanics such as the grappling hook, it was all well received. But the Shangri-La missions weren't. These missions just felt dull, repetitive, and unnecessary. They had no real meaning and just weren't that fun. More of just a pain than anything else. This just leaves players with no interest to play through these missions, as there is no true incentive to do so, and they're more of just padding out of the game to make it even longer for the playtime than anything else. This is easily the worst thing from Far Cry 4. Far Cry Primal. Far Cry Primal is a very unique entry into the series, as it is set at the beginning of the Mesolithic period in Europe. The game involves you being a hunter and working your way through a tribe and eventually becoming the leader. Now, the game itself is nowhere near historically accurate, but it is still a new authentic experience. Unfortunately for most players, they felt like this didn't suit the Far Cry series. Up until this point, every game contained guns, lots of action, and a pretty decent narrative to go with it. With this one, it was a bit all over the place. Me personally, I actually enjoyed going through Far Cry Primal, but it wasn't something that I was religiously following with the story, and I still to this day don't really see it as much of a Far Cry game. This is seen from a lot of players as an experiment which didn't plan out as what many had hoped. Most people would say that it's actually a pretty decent game to play through, it just doesn't fit the Far Cry title at the beginning of it. If it was just called Primal and it was own separate release, most would have been happy with it. There's certainly some good gameplay with a variety of weapons, using different types of bows and spears, and there's even some gameplay mechanics which were used to influence other Far Cries, such as being able to tame animals. But it just did not appeal to the original Far Cry fans. Far Cry 5. Far Cry 5 was released in 2018, and this is where Ubisoft decided to go back to their original approach and follow some sort of narrative within a present day. It contained some amazing features with a massive, vibrant open world, and even started to take some of the good gameplay aspects from Far Cry Primal that players enjoyed, but just put it in a setting that a lot of the original Far Cry fans were happy to play through. But with Ubisoft taking so many gameplay features and mechanics from these other games, there was one problem, and it came down to the AI that was implemented into Far Cry 5. When it comes to AI within Far Cry 5, it just didn't feel real at all. Their interactions with this were extremely slow, and some of the dialogue just didn't really fit the scenarios that well. It was so bad that on the release, forums just got flooded with comments talking about how bad the AI is within this game. It had a significant impact on players that it completely broke any sense of immersion. Some people tried to find the positives out of this by creating content and highlighting how bad it really was by creating funny compilations and funny moment videos. That was probably the best thing that came from it. But overall, it was laughable to see how bad it was implemented into Far Cry 5. Far Cry New Dawn. Far Cry New Dawn was released in 2019, and even though it wasn't as significant as some of the other releases that we've talked about within this video, it still had an amazing open world. But unfortunately, it wasn't as easy to explore that open world. Bear in mind that a reason that a lot of players and a key component of those that do enjoy open world games is exploration, but it comes slightly more challenging when you need to go to certain locations, but you need to make sure that the gear that you have is good enough. It needs to be a high enough level in order for you to explore certain areas due to enemies that were located there. This became very disappointing at times, since it resulted in some areas being restricted right until the end of the game, since only once you have reached a certain point within the narrative where you were a high enough level to adventure into certain areas. This resulted in a lot of people that just wanted to free roam and explore where they currently was, the open world that was available, and not being able to do so. This forced them into a grind that they didn't want to go through. They had to go through the story in order for them to get to a high enough level to explore what they really wanted to explore from the very beginning at the start of the game. Far Cry 6. Far Cry 6 was released in 2021 and probably had the highest marketing budget as well as the most hype from any of the previous Far Cry titles. From its reveal trailers and gameplay reveals, from Ubisoft sharing key details, everything looked good on paper. There was even a lot of hype for the antagonist, which was played by Giancarlo Esposito. Some were even saying that it was going to be even bigger than Vaas from Far Cry 3. There were so many people ready for this game, but unfortunately, the story just did not live up to expectations. The plot itself felt fairly generic, and it was hard to feel connected to any of the characters, despite having some big names behind it as actors. This as a whole really let the game down. Gameplay wise as well as graphically, things were top tier. But as Ubisoft were really trying to push a narrative that was going to blow everyone away, and because of the high expectations which really came down from their marketing team, to have the story play out the way that it did just wasn't that interesting. This finally left players with a feeling that this game had so much potential, but unfortunately it just missed the mark. It wasn't by any means a terrible game, but it just didn't quite get to that point and where people thought that this was great overall. It just ended up being a good standard game. This is the worst thing in every Far Cry game. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it's important to note that it doesn't mean that these games are bad, it just means that there's some things that could have been slightly better. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see things on a slightly more positive side where we're not looking at the worst things, then I highly recommend clicking the next video on screen. That video will take you over to the best things about every single Far Cry, where we go through each title, just like we've done within this video, but instead of highlighting the worst things, we highlight some of the best things and actually praise Ubisoft. So if you do want to see that, click that video on screen and I'll be over there to take you through each and every single one.